Hi there. This is the second part of a presentation that I made earlier this year for the annual Spark Effects conference. I was part of the Meet the Masters compositing panel, in which 5 of us worked together to produce a series of presentations called From V1 to Done, in which we tried to cover a range of skills that you needed as a compositor to get your shot complete. Rather than the whole series being about how to do things in Nuke, I produced 2 presentations that concentrated on the soft skills of compositing. In this part, Know Your Role, I talk about how visual effects is both a technical and creative industry, and how to find that balance between the 2 ways of thinking and be happy with your role as part of this process. This is the second of 2 presentations that I created. The first part, Steps to Success, is also available on this channel, but I don't think it really matters which order you watch them in, so maybe look that one up after you've finished with this one. In my previous presentation, I showed this pie chart that splits the role of the compositor into 3 categories: creative, tech, and admin. That talk was mainly focused on the admin side of things, so this presentation will focus on the other 2, being creative and being technical. I think most of you already know that visual effects and filmmaking in general is a great blend of creativity and technology. I know personally it's one of the reasons I find working in the industry so interesting. So I'm not going to talk about actual compositing technique. I'm going to talk about soft skills again. I'm going to talk about figuring out our role as a compositor, where we fit into the filmmaking process, and when we need to focus on the technical aspects or when we can let our creativity flow. I imagine there being a gradient between a completely creative compositor and a totally technical compositor. And in my head, I have pictures of each of these imaginary extreme artists that I've built up from working with all kinds of people during my career. While I was thinking of these imaginary artists, I thought I'd have a quick look on Adobe stock images to see if they had anything that I could illustrate the next section of my talk with. I searched for creative artist, nerd, and technical artist, and the results were pretty cheesy, and I thought they'd be quite entertaining, so here are some of them. My fictional 100% creative compositor is someone who only grades their CG with soft roto shapes, not ID mats. They'll probably use a gamma correction even though it breaks the linear light of our comp, but they get away with it. They have 3 or 4 defocus nodes, all with different settings and all set to different focal points, and they just mix them all together with a feathered roto. They have a big vignette, and maybe even grade the whole shot at the end of their script just because they feel like it. They don't think about how they're going to recreate this look over the rest of the sequence, and they don't really care about that either. All they care about is making this shot look as cool as possible. Their arch nemesis is my imaginary 100% technical compositor. They refuse to cheat the defocus even just a little bit, because they've set it up using the lens data and this blur is mathematically correct. They spend 45 minutes creating a complex mat with IDs and crypto mats, and then shuffling out and rebuilding all the V-Ray AOVs just to do a small exposure adjustment on the arm of the CG monster, because that's the mathematically correct way to do it, even though it wouldn't look any different if you did it with a roto and a single grade node. Both these imaginary compositors think that they are right, and they both kind of are. Our ultimate aim is to create the best looking images we can, and it shouldn't really matter how we get there. So the creative compositor is correct in that respect. But we're usually trying to recreate reality, or at least trying to make the unreal things that we do create look like they're filmed by real cameras. So our work should be accurate, technically correct, and it should also be procedural so it can be reproduced consistently with big teams over multiple shots. So our 100% technical artist is also correct in a way. Unfortunately, these 2 fictional artists are both so extreme in their views that they always end up arguing with each other and the VFX supervisor and producer. Ideally, we'd be exactly in the middle of these 2 extremes. But in reality, I think everyone naturally fits somewhere along that gradient. I have always thought personally of myself as being closer to the technical end of the scale. I'm always trying to think about how something would look in reality. I sometimes find myself getting frustrated when I'm asked to do something that isn't realistic, even if it makes the shot look better. But I know that I'm really just getting frustrated with myself for thinking too rigidly about the shot in the first place and not thinking about how to just make it look great. When I find myself thinking too technically and complaining about a note that just wouldn't happen in real life, I have to remind myself that films aren't real. Even the live action shots are lit to look good, not real by the people on set. And I try to remember something someone said to me very early on in my career. I was working on Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 2. It was my 3rd project as a compositor, and we were getting towards the end of the show. Every time I put a shot in for review, I thought it was going to be approved, but it would always just get another note. and as a junior I was finding this really frustrating. We were working on a sequence in the Chamber of Secrets, the big vault under Hogwarts. I got a note in dailies about the lighting direction being wrong on part of my shot, and it made me realise that there was actually no visible light sources anywhere in the whole set. There were pools of light in the CG environment, but there was no indication of where this light was actually coming from. I complained to the much more experienced compositor next to me, how can the lighting direction be wrong when you can't even see any of the lights? Where is this light coming from anyway? It should all be pitch black, we shouldn't see anything. He just very calmly replied, the light is coming from the same place the music is coming from. This made me laugh and remember that the movies are made up, and that's the whole point of them. And I try to remember this every time I'm asked to do something that isn't real. And I try not only to think about how something should look, but how I could make it look better. Having said that, it is important to know how to make something look totally real. The viewers need to be able to be drawn into the stories that they are watching, and a distractingly bad visual effects shot is a surefire way of pulling someone out of the fantasy world that the director is trying to create. Reality is the perfect place to start when you're putting your shot together and deciding how things should look initially. But knowing where and when you can move away from reality and how far you can push it, that's what changes visual effects from a science into an art. So knowing how to be technically correct and being creative are equally important skills for a compositor. Knowing when one is more important than the other is tough, but it's a really important part of being a good visual effects artist. One thing that is important to remember as visual effects artists is that we are usually hired to make someone else's vision come true. On one level, we are just here to push buttons and make whatever the director asks for. This is usually more true on the larger projects, as there are more people in the chain who have had opinions or have already decided how things should look before the shot gets to you in comp. And your shots aren't individual entities, they have to work in the context of the rest of the movie. Luckily, filmmaking is a collaborative process, so there is usually still some room for a little creative input from the compositing artist, even on the biggest blockbuster movies. But knowing when you can throw more creative ideas into the mix, or when you should just do exactly what was asked for, is a tough call, and there isn't always an easy answer to the question. It can depend on all kinds of variables, including things like what stage of the project you're at, how far along you are in your shot, how clear the brief or the feedback from the director or the supervisor was, the personalities of other people that you're working with in the project, or your relationship with other people in your team. The first couple of variables in that list are easy to deal with. There is usually a lot more room for creative ideas earlier on in a project. There is more time, other shots haven't been finalized yet, and the style and the look of things haven't been locked down yet. Everything is still flexible. People are open to new ideas and there's still time to implement them. But as you get closer to the end of the project, there is much less room for big creative ideas, especially if they would affect other shots or assets or effects that have already been approved or are already underway. And this is the same on your shot level. Even though each individual shot has to match others around it, there is still room for some creative decisions on a shot. But again, if your shot is due to be delivered tomorrow and it's almost finished, maybe now isn't the time to suggest a big change. Knowing whereabouts you are in the project schedule is a relatively simple thing to gauge. There still isn't hard and fast rules about when it's too late to make creative ideas, but at least you have some numbers you can look at. It's also reasonably easy to work out if the client or supervisors have a clear idea of what they want or not. Do they give clear and specific directions and notes, or are they vague about what they ask for and say things like, "It just doesn't feel right," or "I need 20% more magic"? And if they give clear notes and you hit them, do they change their mind again and ask for something else, or do they say, "That's great, let's move on"? If the people above you in the chain know exactly what they want, then there probably isn't going to be as much room for you to add your own big creative ideas to the project. You're going to be there to give them exactly what they ask for, which might sound dull, but the show is probably going to run quite smoothly. If the people in charge don't really know what they're looking for, you might end up doing loads of versions with loads of looks, which means you're going to have plenty of room to try out different stuff and interpret their vague feedback however you like. This can be really fun, but it can also be a sign that there'll be plenty of overtime in your future. And don't get too precious about any of the ideas you come up with, because there could be a good chance that they end up picking the version you sent them 3 weeks ago. The rest of the variables that you need to think about when deciding when you need to keep your head down and do what they ask for, or when you can offer up some suggestions and ideas, are all based on personalities, relationships, and egos. And these are much harder to measure. Relationships between you and the other members of your team are really important and can rely on all kinds of stuff. I've worked on some shows for months and barely had any interaction with the supervisors outside of the review suites. I'm not even sure if they would have known what I looked like, as we would have only ever talked in a dark room all facing in the same direction. This made it hard for me to feel confident to pitch big ideas. I tended just to do what they asked for on those shows. The opposite have been the shows where I've had great rapport with the supervisors and I've felt much more comfortable to put suggestions out there. Obviously, these relationships depend on both sides being open to building them, but you should definitely think about how you interact with other people. Relationships also take time to build. It's hard to feel like you can suggest things if you've only just joined a show and it's the first time you've worked with that supervisor. But if you've worked with the team a few times and you've already proved that you know what you're doing, a few crazy ideas won't tarnish your reputation with them. The rest of the team are also going to be much more receptive to your suggestions if they already know that you can get everything else done as well as coming up with new ideas. I think one of the reasons I feel more comfortable being at the technical end of the spectrum is that the answers are much more empirical. They're either right or wrong. Being creative is much more subjective. Everyone has their own opinions. So putting a creative idea out there feels much more personal. If someone doesn't like a creative decision that I've made, it's hard not to take it to heart. And this is where your ego comes into play. It's great if you feel like you can put forward your creative ideas, but remember there'll be a million reasons why they might not be accepted. Try not to take offense or get dejected, or cause a scene if your idea isn't picked. It could be that it wouldn't work with the rest of the sequence. It could be that it would change a bunch of shots that have already been approved. It could just be a matter of taste, or even if the supervisor likes it, they know the director won't buy it. And remember that everyone else has an ego too. Sometimes someone else just isn't going to accept your idea because it wasn't their idea. Learning to deal with these situations is hard but an important part of being a visual effects artist. Although it feels really good to be able to have some creative influence over your shots and feel like you had some impact on the final project, it's hard to achieve that when you're part of a really big team on a big project. It's even hard on a small project if the director already knows exactly what they want. But that doesn't mean you can't find other ways to get satisfaction from your work. If I know that there isn't going to be much room for creativity on a show, I can concentrate on being a great technical compositor. I'll take pride in turning my notes around as fast as I can, or getting my shots through tech check first time. One of my favourite projects that I've ever worked on was Chappie at Image Engine. The CG asset of Chappie was one of the most well-made assets I've ever seen, and the style of the show was very naturalistic. The renders that we were getting from lighting were so good that we hardly had to do anything to them in compositing. This wasn't a particularly exciting show for a compositor, but I finaled 61 shots on that movie. 61 shots. That was what I took pride in from that show. And I think that Chappie is still one of the best looking visual effects projects I've ever worked on, and it was totally down to the lighting. I've also worked on projects that have had invisible effects that had to be pixel perfect. This work is really hard, but not necessarily creative. I can take pride in being technically good enough to get these shots done, and there can be creativity in coming up with clever techniques for a tricky technical problem. And although I consider myself more technical, there have been the projects where I've had the chance to come up with the look for an effect or a sequence, or I've had to throw all my creative ideas at a shot. I'll be honest, and I say that these situations can sometimes make me a little nervous, but it's a thrill when I can create something that everyone loves. And I've worked on shows where the VFX have been nothing special at all, either technically or creatively, but I've needed to deliver 3 shots in 2 days. These shots might not end up on my show reel, and I definitely wouldn't call them technically perfect, but it's a great feeling to know that I can also work quick and dirty when I need to, so that we can keep the client happy and we can all leave the office on time. So my point here is, it's important to be able to adjust your expectations for each project. If you go into a project, or even your career, expecting to always be able to do things exactly the way you want to do them, you're never going to be happy, and neither will the people you work with. Knowing when your job is just to be another cog in the process, or when you can offer up new creative ideas, and accepting that they're both equally important roles, will not only keep your team happy, but it will also help you be happier in yourself. Unfortunately, it takes time to figure a lot of this stuff out, and a lot of trial and error too. You'll definitely make some mistakes, but as long as you learn from them, you shouldn't let that put you off trying. I hope you enjoyed these 2 videos from my Spark presentation. They're a little bit different from what I normally do. Most of my other videos are more direct tips and tricks for Nuke. If you like these softer skills videos, let me know in the comments below. And if you want to find out when I upload more tips for Nuke, please hit subscribe. Thanks.